Dr. Lewis Meyers. Thank you for talking with me. What's your official last name?
Myers. It used to be Lewis, but then I got married several years ago, so now it is Myers.
Got it. Let's start at the very, very beginning, which is where and when were you born?
Yeah, so I was born in Tacoma, Washington in 1991. So I am a 90s baby. I like to say the greatest heir of all time.
And what month? Because I'm interested in your astrological sign.
September.
Are you a Virgo or a Libra?
I am a Virgo.
And I think of Virgos as being good hearted, communicative, caring. That seems like it fits you pretty well.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
Um, what this for in terms of understanding women today, what kind of messages did you get growing up about what it was to be a good girl, a good woman, uh, someone that people looked up to?
Yeah, so I would say for me personally, I feel like I got conflicting messages. So I think on one side, some of the messages are to be a good girl, you must be strong, you must be intelligent, you must also, dress a certain way, wear your hair a certain way. There are these beauty standards. But then I think on the other side, I also got the sort of images and narratives of, well, you can't be too strong because, you need to find a husband, right? And so there was definitely those narratives that were instilled. And also, you don't want to be too smart because if you're too smart, that might intimidate the boys and, that might intimidate your potential partner. And so there was always, I feel like, these conflicting messages that I got, but I always have sort of been the type of person I'm going to like navigate through these messages and deal with it in my own way rather trying to conform to either one or the other.
Do you have siblings?
I do. So I have one older sister, but mostly everyone thinks that I'm the oldest, but she is actually older than me.
And what kind of example did she set for you? Sometimes we react against our older sibling, we do the opposite, or sometimes we're really influenced by them. How did she influence your view of becoming a woman?
Yeah, so I think from her, I think that she really fell into the stereotypical gender norms of what it means to be a girl or a female or a woman growing up. So she was, as most people say, quote unquote, girly. So really into the pinks, really into the Barbie, really stereotypical in what you would expect, what society expects of what a girl, how a girl should be. I, on the other hand, was the opposite of that. And so that tended to annoy her a little bit because I was not, quote unquote, girly. And in fact, a lot of times growing up, I got called a tomboy. You're tomboyish, right? And so that narrative was really, and that label was really placed on me because I wanted to play sports, which was not seen as feminine, or I wanted to, do football. I wanted to play with trucks. I wanted to go out and explore bugs. And these are all things that are stereotypically not seen as something that's feminine or something that's quote unquote girly. And so I think that her influence was that I became the opposite. And I don't necessarily know if that was something on purpose or if that was just the way that I was. But I was like, I know that, Barbies are okay, but at the same time, why can't I play basketball? Why can't I do these things? And so I think one of the things that she really influenced me was this idea, and I still do it all the time, is questioning why do girls have to be this certain way? Or why does society say we have to be this certain way? Why can't I be my own way? And so I think that's how she kind of influenced me.
And did she go on to graduate school like you?
She did not go on to graduate school. So my sister, she has a high school education.
How interesting. What about your parents? Do they have college education?
They both do not. So both of them did not finish college. So my mom went to college for a semester, and the same thing with my dad. And he later ended up joining the army. And then my mom, she did a variety of jobs. So I'm actually the first in my immediate family to have my bachelor's, master's, and PhD.
Did you have mentors along the way who said, you are so bright, you've got to take this course and take this AP course and whatever? Or, it seems like we need some kind of role models, mentor, encouragement to go against the family grain. Did you have that?
Yeah, I would say my family first and foremost. They might not have understood exactly what it meant to be in college necessarily, but they always pushed me. And I think my cousin in particular, she kind of saw, she was a little bit older than me, and she kind of saw I was taking all these AP courses. And she was one of the first people to say, well, why are you doing that? Why don't you instead do college in high school? Because where I'm from, if you do college in the high school while you're still in high school, it's called Running Start. You actually get your first 2 years completely paid for.
Wow.
And so the only thing that you have to do as a high school student is pay for your books. So it was navigating that, but she encouraged, instead of doing 2 years of AP credits, why don't you do 2 years of your first 2 years of college? And so she kind of inspired that in me. Really, she kind of started that narrative, and then I think along the way I found other mentors who encouraged me. I first thought that I was going to be a medical doctor, and so that's sort of the trajectory I was on. Once I transferred from community college, I did a semester pre-med, and then what kind of changed is I had another mentor come along, and I did a sociology of childhood class. And one of the reasons why I was taking that class was because I found that a lot of pediatricians don't necessarily have the people skills, right? They don't have so I wanted to learn more about the behaviors of children and about how to interact better with children as a potential physician. Obviously, I took a different route, but my mentor at the time encouraged me to do McNair Scholars. And so that program really perpetuated me and pushed me into going into the PhD and preparing for graduate school.
Mm. So when you were in high school, were you full-time in community college, or did you take some high school classes as well?
Yeah, so I did both. So I did part-time community college and part-time high school, and I ended up because you get in my state, you get both college credit and high school credit when you're doing it. It covers high school courses. I actually ended up finishing most of my high school classes earlier. So by the time my senior year, I was only taking one class at the high school, and so it worked out pretty nicely that I was mostly at the community college campus most of the day.
That's great. It saves a lot of money. That's a terrific program. We have that in terms of Butte Community College here in Butte County. Yeah, where people can do that. What did your family say about Barbies? Because you couldn't be whiter, blonder, more weirdly female than Barbie. How was that, or was it just not discussed?
It really wasn't discussed as much. I think that my mom in particularly tried her best to get Barbies that were more representative of Black girls. But I think even then, like the representation has just changed since I was a little kid. We're still growing and we're still moving, but I think that back then the Barbies were they might have had black skin, but it was basically the white Barbie just with darker skin, pretty much. the only thing she didn't have was the skin color and the eye color, but the hair was, bone straight, and she was still like really tiny, and, just what we expect of like what our white middle class dominant norms of what a Barbie should quote unquote look like.
Although
And so I think
nobody really does, but yeah.
exactly. No one can't
I hope
really
not.
look like that.
They've done studies
Yeah.
about how unhealthy she is in terms of her proportions and, her feet perpetually in high heels.
Yeah. You wouldn't think that would be comfortable.
No, it's not.
uh,
What do you see in terms of some of your students at Chico State are still teenagers? So what do you see in terms of that? Be strong, be smart, but don't threaten men because eventually you want to get one. Has that changed?
I think it has in some ways. I do see my students trying to struggle with that narrative, but as you know, I teach multicultural and gender studies, and when we talk about gender and sexuality, and we talk about feminism, and we talk about all these different concepts, some of the students still struggle with these things, right? And so I've had students who they're like, yeah, I get that. And yeah, trying to or wanting to end sexist oppression is great. And at the same time, like, are we going too far? And like trying to like really muddle with and struggle through this idea. I think that students are still struggling with it. So I think that it is different. I think that they're still getting those messages. And I think a lot of times what I have seen personally in my teaching is that it is still coming from the media heavily, but there has been these alternative representations that allow students to navigate in that way. And I think there is more pressure from families in saying that you need to be this way to be a woman, or this is what womanhood looks like. And so I see students sort of struggling and trying to navigate through both. But I've also seen students who have, very supportive families who are creating what gender means, what gender norms are to them in their own way, in their own right. So I think I've seen both ends of the spectrum from students.
You mentioned that they have alternative models or representations. What's an example of that?
Yeah, so I would say like an example of that is I know when I was growing up, it would be unheard of to have a woman referee, for example, in men's sports. And I know, I think it was a few years ago, there was the first woman who was a referee in football. And so that was a huge deal, and it might seem as something, that small. But it is a huge deal to see that representation of women. Women can do this. It's like men have always been in women's sports in some ways, being coaches, being assistant coaches and stuff. But for some reason, when a woman does that, it's seen as like, oh, that's kind of strange, or that's kind of like odd that she's doing that. So I think just representation of a variety of women saying, no, we can also be and do these things well. This doesn't have to mean that you're masculine or that there's something wrong with you. We can also do these things too and be perfectly capable as well. So that's what I mean when I say like these alternative representations that women have access to.
When they talk about influencers on Instagram and maybe TikTok, they have, I don't know, millions of followers. And it seems influencers mean that tells you how to put on makeup, what kind of clothes to buy, what brands are cool now. And I don't see any of the influencers as being positive. Am I missing something?
Yeah, so I think it's all in just from my experience with my students. I think it's all in who they are following, because I think some students are following those who tell you, okay, this is how you need to contour your face, or this is how, this needs to look, or, this is the fashion forward, wear this in this season. But I think there are also from my understanding and from, what the students talk about in class, there are also influencers who are talking about being activists.
Oh.
There are also influencers who are, like, for example, on Instagram, who are sharing when they are doing a variety of activist work on the ground, or they are sharing their hashtag activism, or they are sharing, this event happened today and you can support this organization in doing this work. So I think there are multiple ways in which there are influences. I think that it just depends on who people are following, because there are some people who, they just tend to follow the makeup and the fashionistas and stuff like that. But there's other students that are following the activists, and they're following Black Lives Matter movement, and they're following, Say Her Name and Let Her Learn, and a variety of movements that are talking about really important issues that are affecting us today. So I think that term influencer and what that means for students and people in general just depends on who you are actually following.
Maybe see if you agree with this. The most famous young woman activist is Greta Thunberg. Everybody knows about her.
Yes, I would not agree with that.
Oh, okay.
But I think that there are some people who think that she is the most, famous. I think that she is one of the most talked about, right? But I do think that it depends on what community you come from, in terms of seeing her as, like, the most famous. Because especially when I think of young influencers, like, I think of Little Miss Flint and the work that she's doing in Flint, Michigan with the water.
Yeah.
Yes, and with the lead in the water. Or I think of indigenous folks who are still fighting against the Dakota pipeline, right? And so, but I think that my experience and the way in which I view activism and the people who I am exposed to is different. And so I think that experience in itself shapes the way in which who I follow, quote unquote, or who I see as, the most famous or doing the work. And I think that it has been set up not to diminish or say Greta's work isn't important, because her work is important. But I think, again, there's this historical narrative where communities of colors get left out. Right. And although that communities of colors are doing work, they tend to get left out in the narrative. And it's like, well, you can do the on the ground work, but we still need a white face to be the quote unquote representative of this movement, of this thing that we're doing. And so I think that's what has happened, or what you've seen with Greta, because there have been a ton of activists before Greta that have been doing very similar work, but they happen to be people of color and indigenous folks. And so I think that it's a narrative that repeats itself.
What Greta and friends did was find their, some would say, token African activist, Vanessa Nakate, however you say her last name. She becomes kind of a token. She's our person of color. To think again about college students, an issue around the world except sub-Saharan Africa is 60% of the students are women, and they're more likely to graduate, go on to graduate school, which is a huge shift. And I wonder what you see in terms of what's happened to the men. Why are the women excelling in terms of your own experience and what you know globally?
Yeah. I think that is such a good question. I think one of the things that I have seen is that more men are taking, and I don't even like calling it alternative route, maybe a different route. So going into, like, more trades. right? I have seen a number of students. I have a few construction management students, for example, right? But a lot of them are complaining, like, why do we have to spend all this money, on a 4-year degree when I could go to trade school? But more and more, even the trades are now valuing a bachelor's degree and getting some of that theoretical knowledge as well as the hands-on knowledge. And so that's one of the things that I have personally seen is that men are starting to take more or other routes besides just the 4-year bachelor's degree. I think depending on the population, I think with both women and men, quite frankly, there is a lack of support at the university that exists. I mean, there just is on a broad scale. There is a lack of support, especially again going to communities of color. There is a lack of a sense of belonging in a lot of spaces. If you are going to a PWI, a predominantly white institution, that makes your decision of, well, should I do something else, or am I going to feel supported? Do I feel like I belong in this space? What does that mean for me as, for example, a Black man on campus where, there might only be 2% of Black males on campus or 2% of Black people on campus. And so I think that men are navigating and trying to figure out what does that mean for them. And that's not to say women aren't doing that, because I think that they absolutely are doing that. But I think that there are, in some instances, there are more support avenues, or there's a presentation of more support avenues, if you will, for women than there are for men. And that's just in my personal experience with students. That's kind of what I have been seeing.
I want to ask you about the nature of that support, but I interviewed a 23-year-old college senior at Hunter College in New York City, and she said, and I've interviewed some young men who said the same thing. When she grew up, the feeling was boys are troublemakers, the teachers don't like them, the girls are the teacher's pet, the girls are the ones who get dialogued with and supported, which is so interesting to me because we used to say decades ago, oh no, the teachers dialogue with the boys, the girls say something, the teacher says the boys say, oh well, tell me more what you're thinking about that. So there's been some kind of shift in the people that I've talked to in their perception of who teachers like, and that makes a big difference. If you think
Absolutely.
I'm not really welcome, people
Absolutely.
think I'm a troublemaker. The other thing that was interesting that this young woman said is that her friends were man haters. Even if they were heterosexual and dated boys, when they dated a boy, they were supportive of that girl. But in general, they talked about they don't like men. That was
Okay.
very interesting to me because it's such a broad category of discrimination, to say we don't like men. And I asked her where that came from, and she said part of it was a lot of them in this middle class community in Long Island where she grew up, their parents were divorced, and the fathers were not often in good harmony with the kids or the mother. So they kind of learned at home men are the bad guys. And
Mm.
any observations about that? Because it's kind of striking to me.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, and I can definitely see how that narrative can be portrayed, especially if you're in a community that is mostly led by or predominantly led by women, and maybe there wasn't the best experience with men. And I think that our society has also, by and large, has. I think there's two things going on. I think there's on one side there is this toxic masculinity that does exist, And I think on the other side, there is this way where men are being represented more in negative acts. So we're recognizing or starting to more talk about the perpetuation, and not that women don't do it, because they do, but the perpetuation of things like sexual harassment on college campuses and how men are represented in that area. So I think there are two narratives that are going on that can create an environment where it is easy to have disgust, distrust, and a hatred for men, whether you are straight, bi, whatever. There can be this hatred for men. So I think that our society can create this structure where it's like, okay, now we do hate men. And if you're not careful and you're not navigating through that, it's easy to be on the other side of the coin of domination and thinking about how we are starting to generalize and stereotype that all men are in this category, regardless of their background, regardless if we know them, but this is all men. And so, yeah, I definitely think that's an interesting point that she brought up.
Yeah. The Me Too movement probably fed that some. And I know there were hashtags from men, not all men, to say, hello, I don't harass people. In your classes, what percentage are female, what percent are male? I mean, let's pretend there's just two categories for now.
Yeah, so I would say interesting in my online class, out of 15 students, 13 are women and 2 are men. And then in one of my in-person classes, I would say it's about split, about 50-50 or 40-50, with it more so leaning to 60% women. And then in my other in-person class, I would say it's probably about 30% men and 70% women. So most of my classes are very female dominated.
What are you teaching, and what will you teach? What are your subjects that you like to teach?
Yeah, so I'm currently teaching multicultural and gender studies, the introduction to multicultural gender studies. And then I'm also teaching in the honors program a course called Justice. Unfortunately, that class will be going away, but I will be later on teaching a class in the honors program called Art. And so for me, a part of my practice and a part of my work is looking at visual culture and visual arts, and particularly looking at photography and how we use images to understand the world. And so I'll be teaching mostly from that lens. And in the future, I do hope to develop a course that will focus on Black girlhood, and particularly the experiences Black girls have in educational spaces. And then also I will be teaching classes related to African American studies. So probably the introduction and probably contemporary problems in African American studies as well.
I think this is true. See if you agree that the group of people that are least likely to be married are Black women. Black men are more likely to be married. Other ethnic groups are likely. What's going on there?
Yes, so I think that is still true. I know it has been true in the past, and I think that it is. I would feel comfortable in saying that. I think that is true. But I think that there are multiple reasons for that. I think one of which Malcolm X, I'm going to paraphrase what he said, but, that Black women are the least desirable, least protected, women in society. And I think that is still the case today. Not desirable in saying that, oh, no one, there's a perspective that no one wants her, right? She's not beautiful. We are not beautiful, right? And so I think that there is this narrative that perpetuates this, that Black women are not beautiful, which, as a Black woman, I think that's not true. But I think that there is this narrative that is perpetuated about Black women's beauty. So I think that goes into Black women are the least likely, last time that I checked, are the least likely to date interracially, but Black men do date interracially. So what does that also mean, right? And what does that also imply if there is a small number of Black men who are available versus Black women who are available? So I think that there is that issue that is going on. I also think that there is, Black women are very educated and more educated in terms of credentials. And so I think with that comes a lot of times a sacrifice. And I think, quite frankly, our world, our society is intimidated by educated Black woman who is getting all these variety of credentials. And I mean education very broadly. And so I think that all of these things create this storm and this reasoning behind perhaps why Black women don't get married. I think there's also too this increasing recognition that I don't have to get married. That that doesn't have to be a desire of mine, and that's okay. And I think that more and more Black women are recognizing that if I don't want to get married, and that's not my desire, and I want to focus on my career, for example, or I want to focus on me and becoming the best version of myself, I think there's also that recognition that is becoming more increasingly a reality.
I think there's also a stereotype that Black women are less likely to play the, oh, you're so big, strong, handsome man, and I'm just like, need your open doors for me, and they're less likely to think that's the way it's okay to behave. Do you think that's a accurate stereotype?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think that Black women, even if we do or don't do that, I think that we are also stereotyped as aggressive, right? So if I'm not playing into that narrative, I'm seen as aggressive. But even if I am playing into that narrative, I'm still judged against this aggressive label that has been put on Black women. So yeah, I would definitely say that is something that has been stereotyped about Black women. Absolutely.
Yeah. I interviewed Indian women in East India, and they said it's so wonderful to have arranged marriage because you don't have to play the dating game. So you don't have to do the, oh, and, flirt and build ego and all that stuff. So they get around that by not dating.
Yeah. Oh, I bet. I mean, I'm sure there's other interesting and complicated things that comes with being arranged, but yeah, that's one of the things you can get around.
Right. Do you want to say a word about your spouse?
Um, I mean, what would you like to know?
What ethnic group your spouse comes from?
So my husband, he's white, and so and we talk about this all the time because it's very interesting how like commercials now, I have never seen as many interracial couples in my life. I mean, when I was growing up, there was not there was not that on TV at all.
Right.
And so I see more and more of, especially Black women with white men on commercials and stuff. But it's interesting that Black women are the least likely to actually date interracially, whether that is white, Asian, Mexican, you name it. And so I think that's interesting that that narrative or that representation is put out there, but we are the least likely. But yeah, my husband, he is white.
Mm-hmm. Um, and is he an academic as well?
He's not an academic. He is an HR. So he is not remotely close in anything academics. He listens to my academic things, but he is not in academia.
That's kind of nice in a way because then you can have a balance. Before we leave teenagers, to me, a huge issue is that around the world, increasing rates of anxiety and depression for teens, especially girls. And as someone with a sociology background, I'm wondering what you think is going on. Someone like Jean Twenge says, oh, it's social media. I don't think it's mostly social media. I think it's pressure to achieve. But I want to know what you think. Why increase? It's definitely increased rates of anxiety and depression, especially for girls.
Yeah, I would 100% say it is pressure. I mean, I think there is an aspect of social media that comes with that. But I think behind that is pressure because there is this pressure to look a certain way, right? We were talking about influencers earlier and the whole makeup movement, if you wear makeup, and putting it on a certain way, or pressure to buy certain brands that are ridiculously, outrageously expensive when you can probably get that from a drugstore, and it'll cost way cheaper and it'll still look good, right? And so I think that there is enormous pressure to be a certain way, to fit a certain way, to have your hair a certain way, to be a certain complexion, right? To be a certain size. And so I think that that brings this anxiety because if you're not fitting into, well, this is what a beautiful woman, girl looks like, and you're sensitive or you're aware of this is the construction or this is the attitudes about what it means to be beautiful, then that can hurt when you don't fit that. And if you are not confronted with or have alternative images or alternative representation to say it's okay to look like how you look, you are still beautiful. If you have an afro, if you have really curly hair, if you have, straight hair, you are still beautiful. All these ways in which you are is beautiful. You don't have to be a size 0 or a size 4 even. Whatever size you are, that is still beautiful. And so I would definitely say pressure is huge around that. I see that in my college students all the time. I was just talking with my husband about this, and I was saying I have never seen depression and anxiety as high as it is now. I have never, in college students, I have never seen that. And I think that there's this constant and perpetual narrative that we live in, all of us live in, to be a certain way. And then it's go to college, do good in college, get the job that pays a lot of money. But then you come to college and you find out, well, only some jobs pay a lot of money, not all. And even if I'm even passionate, do I have passion about this job that pays a lot of money, or am I more passionate about this field that doesn't pay a lot of money, but this is where my desire lies. This is where my heart lies. And so I think there are a lot of different narratives that young people are trying to navigate. And sometimes it can be hard if you don't have those alternatives or you don't have those outlets. And I also do recognize that there is an anxiety and depression that is happening just globally, that, recognizing that we have all dealt with this pandemic, this global trauma on different levels, and then also recognizing that people are diagnosed with having these challenges, these mental health challenges as well. And so I think that there are multiple things going on. But yeah, I was literally talking to my husband about this the other day, that so many college students I see are really, really struggling with this. And sometimes the university fails to recognize that they are more than students. And so they need more than just being students. I understand they are coming to the university to get their degrees. But they don't just say, well, I'm just going to be a student and leave the other parts of my identities at home. No, that comes with them. And so there needs to be more of this acknowledgement from the universities that we need to do more for students. We need to support more things. Some of them, this is the first time they are away from home. For some of my students, I know I was just talking to one of my students the other day, and she was saying for her, this is the first time that she's been in a community that is predominantly white. And so that is culture shock growing up in a community where it is very diverse and there are a lot of different cultures and ethnicities that live together within a space. And so I think there are multiple things that are creating this pressure and this need to want to be a certain way and trying to understand your own identity as well.
I'm sure the counseling center, from people that I've talked to, recognize the problem, but they don't have enough staff to see everybody who needs to be seen. So there needs to be just more helpful people that students can talk with. Or I wonder about sometimes peer counseling, peer support groups can be very effective. Is there anything like that on campus?
There is. I know some students are a little bit apprehensive about this, depending on what their experience with therapists, counselors, group counseling have been. If it's a negative one, they're a little bit more apprehensive, or if they are more introverted, they're a little bit more, I don't think I want to go to like a group,
And spill my
I
guts in front of a group. Yeah.
Exactly, and like knowing these are my peers and I might see them on campus, that might be kind of weird. And so
Uh,
I think there are different attitudes about group counseling and quite frankly counseling in general, because in some cultures that's a no-no. You don't go to counseling. You don't do that, or that's not something that is acceptable. There's other ways in which you deal with the problems or the challenges that you're dealing with. And so I think that it does depend. But there are resources on campus for that.
I'm wondering if there's any connection with increasing gender questioning, gender fluidity. Am I bi, straight, gay, trans, asexual? Um, I have a grandson who's 11, and he has kids who are a little bit older who have come out as non-binary, and he has a friend to whom he used to be engaged at her initiation who now says she's a lesbian. And I think probably when you and I, especially me, were growing up, 11-year-olds weren't talking about sexual preference or being non-binary.
Not really. I would say there were some people in my class that you knew. They might not have stated it, but you knew. And I've had several classmates now that we're older that have come out as trans. But you knew back then, but it wasn't talked about. And it wasn't as acceptable. I think nowadays it's a little bit more acceptable, I feel like, than when I was growing up, because I know when I was growing up, people would use the term gay very derogatory, like, oh, that's gay, like in a derogatory manner. And I feel like nowadays, more so than not, people will call you out for saying things like that. But when I was growing up, that was common, practice, that was used as like, oh, that's a very negative thing. But sexuality wise, those things weren't talked about. I think that being in the LGBTQ community when I was growing up was seen as like, oh, that's gross, or that's weird, or you're an outcast. So there were a lot of people who did not talk about that, but you knew that they were a part of the community, but it wasn't talked about. And as adults, it's like, they come out and you're like, oh, that totally makes sense. That totally was, that makes complete sense. I'm not shocked at all. It's just that it wasn't talked about, and it wasn't something that was acceptable.
I did a book where I interviewed 54 young women, girl climate activists around the world, and one of them I'm thinking of is British, and she is anxious because she says, I'm non-binary, but I present as female. Like she wears dresses and has kind of long curly hair. So she's anxious because her presentation doesn't fit how she feels inside. So I'm wondering if that kind of fluidity can be difficult. It's not, you're not, okay, it's not, okay, I've got a penis, I got a vagina, I know kind of what's expected of me now. There's a lot more freedom, and that can be a little shaky.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think that too, there can be, so, I'm cisgender and not a part of the LGBTQ community, but very much so tried my best to be an ally. But I think that there is pressure that if you are saying you are a part of the LGBTQ community in any kind of ways, now there's this pressure that you better represent that you are, a part of the community. So like you were saying with the activist, she's saying that she's non-binary, but mostly presents as female. And some people might question her like, well, are you really non-binary? But it's like, well, you're missing the point of what it means to be non-binary. Like I can dress or behave more what is considered masculine, one day and be more female one day. But it's really recognizing that there's not this, it's either black or it's white, it's either this or it's this. It's recognizing that our genders are on a spectrum all the time. And I don't have to conform to, one or the other. But I think that sometimes when people do say that they're a part of the LGBTQ community, there's even stereotypes within that, or you should act this way if you're claiming that you are a lesbian, or you should act this way if you are claiming that you are asexual. And it's like, I think that a part of that is our society is so obsessed with labels. We have to label people and we have to put them in the box. And it's like, well, if you're acting outside this box, we don't really know what to do with that. We're confused about, well, you said you're this, but you're not acting how I expected. You're acting very differently.
Or your hair is different.
Yes, or your hair is different. I thought you said you're non-binary, but you're curling your hair. I think a lot of times people miss the point of what it actually means. And, I'm always like, I allow people to identify the way they want to identify. Who am I to tell someone, well, you're claiming this, but you're acting this way? That's none of my business. That's not my responsibility. I think our responsibility is to allow people to identify the way that they want to identify and the way that they feel comfortable. And if they say that they are non-binary and they mostly are having feminine traits, who am I to say that that's wrong? Maybe internally there are some more masculine things going on, and not masculine in the stereotypical sense, but masculine in the sense that I'm free to express my identity in these terms. And so, I don't know, that's just how I kind of think about it.
Right. An issue that's big in the women's movement that surprises me is trans men. I think maybe J.K. Rowling kind of kicked it off by saying, I don't accept that a trans man is a man. And then they're pro-trans men feminists and anti-trans men feminists. And it seems like it's a fairly big issue, and I don't really get why it is, because there's not that many trans men in the world, probably.
Yeah, and so I've actually found the opposite with some of my students in talking about trans women. The other day I was having a student, she writes about trans athletes. And so one of the things that she was writing about, is it fair if someone is a trans woman and they are competing against people who are assigned woman at birth? And so that's one of the things that she was debating and arguing. And she is not a trans woman, but she was debating and arguing this in her paper. And, she came to the conclusion of, well, maybe what we should do is just have a category for trans woman And then everyone else, then there's a woman category and there's a male category. And I'm like, I mean, doesn't that defeat defeat the purpose? Because we're still excluding, and we're saying because you are different, you have to be in this different category. You're a woman, but you're not a woman. And so I think that people are on both ends of the spectrum, whether it is a trans woman or a trans man. I think that people are still struggling with this idea and trying to navigate through this idea. And I think that in her case, the big deal was, well, if you're born or assigned male at birth, you have certain hormones that you are born with that are not fair if you are competing with people who are assigned women at birth and choose to live their lives as women. So I think that people are trying to navigate through what this means for our society. And I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier, is that we are obsessed with labeling people. We are obsessed with categorizing people. But also I think that when I was growing up, talking about, I mean, trans people, that was a whole nother, that wasn't even talked about at all. I mean, that wasn't, I think that when I was growing up, it was lesbian, gay, bi, and everyone else that fell out of that, well, you don't exist, or we're not going to acknowledge that you exist. And so I think now there is more of a recognition, although there are still a lot of issues, but there is more of a recognition that trans people do exist, and we can't just ignore or exclude or say, this. So I think, to me, from what I have been seeing and interacting with my students, that is what I have seen is the big deal for them, is trying to navigate what this all means and how we're categorizing people.
I think of the concept of Bradash of Native Americans. So they did have three categories, really. You had
Yes.
you had the men who were living their lives as women, and it was a third category, but it was accepted.
Yeah.
So he's Bradash, he's Two Spirit, he's whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah. So maybe that's a model, but then that is saying there's a third category. So you're not really a woman.
Yes, and I think that is the struggle with our society, because we're saying, okay, you can be accepted as a woman, but then we have to create this other category where we can't just label you as woman. You have to be labeled as a trans woman, and we have to identify you as a trans woman. And there can't just be this category, even if we, stayed on the binary. There can't be a category or male or female, because this person is not technically a woman, they're a trans woman. So there's always there always has to be this third option in our society.
Right. Do you see students using non-traditional pronouns like they instead of he or she, or is, because if you get letterhead from academics, a lot of times they'll put their pronouns like she, her. But do you see young people doing that too?
I would say by and large, I don't, but I do see some of my students. And at the beginning of class, I always ask my students to identify their pronouns if they feel comfortable, because I know some people that could be outing them. But I ask them, if you do want me to call you something else that is not written on what I see, then please let me know either after class or send me email or communicate that with me so that I'm being respectful. But by and large, I have a few students who are non-binary, and so they say I go by any pronouns, and so that's what I abide by. I do have a couple of students who are trans, but have been through the process and have actually changed their names, so their names align with how they present themselves, and so I try to my best to be respectful of that. But I do ask students, what do you want me to call you? This is the paper I have been given, so I don't know if you don't tell me, and if you are not registered with the university under a certain name or certain pronouns, I have no idea. So you have to communicate that with me as you feel comfortable, right? I don't want to force anything on anyone, but as you feel comfortable. And that's just in general with my students, even my students who are cisgendered. I know some of them, they have certain names, but they don't like their name or they go by something else. So I'm like, if you have a nickname you want me to call you, let me know and I will call you that. What is it that you actually feel comfortable with?
Yeah, that's fair. Kind of as a footnote, I don't know if you notice this, but to me, the most difficult task for trans trans women is speech patterns, because they still make declarative statements, don't use tag questions, monologue. Their speech pattern is still assertive like men's. And to me, that's, you can like wear makeup and let your hair grow and whatever, but that's the hardest thing to change from being raised as men to present as women. Do you see that as well or not?
So I haven't had a trans male student. I mostly have had trans women students.
Yeah, that's what I mean, is trans women.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, and so there was this author actually, and I went to her talk, and she's a lesbian author, and she was saying her and her partner, they decided to go to counseling because she said, we realize even though we're lesbians, we're still replicating the very dominant and the very negative aspects of being in a heterosexual relationship. So it's like, even though we're not in a heterosexual relationship, we're tending to do these things that society tells us that, oh, this is normal, this is natural, when in fact it's dominance. It's not normal or natural. It's just that we have ingrained in our society. And so I think that absolutely, even if you are, a part of the community, you can still replicate that without meaning to actually replicate that. But when you have lived in society that is under male dominance and tells you, this is what it means to be a man, in a very toxic way, I think it is very easy, even if you are not a part of the community necessarily anymore, it is very easy to replicate that. Yeah. And it is hard to not perpetuate that dominance.
Right. It just, your language acquisition gets imprinted in your brain. So I think it's really hard to change language patterns. Let me ask you about, when you're talking with your students about feminism, how do you define it? And are most of them, oh, duh, yes, of course I'm a feminist. When I started teaching, students would say, I'm not a feminist because I like men, but I believe in equality. What do you hear now, and how do you define it, and what do they say?
So when I talk about feminism, I first of all talk about how there are different ways that it has been defined over time. And I allow my students to define for themselves. I let them know how I define it and think of it, but I allow them to actually think of it for themselves. And so I say, some people will say feminism is understanding the fight against gender discrimination specifically. Some people will say feminism is fighting for equal rights in comparison to men, fighting for those equal rights. And on the other spectrum, the other sort of definition that I tend to go with is that it is fighting against sexist oppression. And so Bell Hooks, she talks about, why would I want to be equal to my male counterparts when they're also in this narrative, in this space of domination, and they're also facing, depending on their racial background, their ability, their age, and all these other intersectional things, they are also facing domination just in a different way. So they might have quote unquote male privilege because we live in a patriarchal society, but they are still facing unequal things. So why would I want to be equal to domination? Why would I want to be equal to, in this cycle of inequality? And so I heavily lean on Bell Hooks's definition, which is feminism is fighting for the end to sexist oppression. And I feel like for me, that best describes feminism. I know that some of my students, when I talk about that, because I say sexist oppression, so obviously any sex can experience that, right? Regardless of what sex you fall in. But a lot of times people will understand and look at that men do experience prejudice, but not necessarily sexism. And so I ask my students to kind of navigate, well, what does that mean, right? If men experience prejudice based on their gender, based on their sex, but not necessarily sexism. Because if we're looking at sexism in terms of a system of domination and we're looking at it systematically, who actually experiences this? It's women in our society. And so students have a hard time and a struggle with that when I bring up that, because that can go to any isms, right? So can people of color actually be racist? Or do people of color have prejudice thoughts and feelings about people, but not necessarily are racist because they don't have this power that comes with racism, or they don't have this power and systematically. And so asking students to navigate with that is very interesting, because some students have never been exposed to these thoughts or this way of navigating or understanding oppression or understanding the variety of isms and how they operate in our society. And so I do have students do say that they are feminists, but they're mostly comfortable with that. Well, I want to be equal to men. And so that's what feminism means to me, and that's fine. I don't say, no, that's wrong. But I just, try to encourage them to think about, well, what does that mean to be equal to men if they are also too experiencing inequality for a variety of their intersectional identities? And so it's very interesting to have students kind of navigate through these ideas.
Right. When we look at the history of the women's movement, there have been radical feminists, reform feminists, social feminists, cultural feminists, eco-feminist. What kind of approach speaks to you?
Yeah, so I would say for me, the type of feminists that I most align with are Black feminists. In my later years, I have been looking more at critical race feminism to really center the intersex, right? And making sure that it's not only that I am a woman, but I'm also a Black woman. I'm also a Black woman who is now in her 30s. And so making sure all of these different things come to play when I'm thinking about how do I represent myself as a feminism and the work that I do with Black feminism. But I would say, for me personally, I have found comfort, I have found connection, I have found that understanding and things that make the most sense to me in the Black feminist world. I know there's definitely critiques about it, and it's not perfect. But I think for me, that is the type of feminist that I most align myself with.
Who else speaks to you besides Bell Hooks, Roxane Gay? Who else is like, that really makes me think?
Yeah, so I draw a lot of my work from actually Patricia Hill Collins and her work on controlling images, and how that kind of controls our society. As I mentioned earlier, I'm really interested in visual culture and how people construct their experiences and what we can learn from people through how they construct their experiences through things like photography, and through things like documentaries. And so I'm really interested and draw a lot from her. I, of course, draw a lot from Crenshaw and thinking about intersectional feminism and why that is important and why we should we should be doing those things. And so I also draw from a more contemporary Black feminist, Brittany Cooper. And so she critiques a lot of times, she uses Black feminisms, but I like her work because she also critiques it and says, it's okay to use this thing and to critique it. I think a lot of times people are uncomfortable with that idea. It's just like when people say, well, if you don't like America, then you shouldn't be here. And it's like, it's not that I don't like America. I do like this place. It's just that this place has a lot of improvement. And so I can like something and still recognize that it needs to grow. It needs to improve. It needs to change. And so that's one of the things that she does in her work. And she also draws a lot of, she talks about sexuality a lot in her work. Of Black feminism. And so those are some of the scholars that I tend to pull from in my work.
Do you know if Kate Crenshaw is still teaching at UCLA? I wonder if she's still in academia.
Kimberly?
Kate Crenshaw, the intersectionality person. Do you think she's still teaching?
Are you talking about Kimberly Crenshaw?
Oh, is it Kimberly? Sorry.
Yes. Yes. No, okay. You're fine. Yes.
Yeah, I knew it was okay.
I think that she does more so. I'm not sure if she's still teaching. I think that she does because now she has an organization. She does a lot of, as you can imagine, she does a ton of different talks. She is also still very active in the legal world. As you might know, her training is actually in being a lawyer and in the legal sector. And so she still does work there. So I can't tell you for sure if she is still actively teaching or not. She probably does. I would imagine she probably does teach a class here or there, but she has a lot of different aspects of her work that she is actively involved in.
Do you have to be Black to be a Black feminist?
Oh, such a great question that I get. And I honestly, for me, I would say when people who are not Black women who want to use Black feminism, I always ask why. There are so many different types of feminisms that can align with, someone who is not a Black feminist. So that is a hard question, I think, to answer, and one that I muddle with and struggle with. And I always ask, and I go back to, what is your intention behind using Black feminism if you are not a Black person in general? Because I have seen also Black men use Black feminism. And even asking, what does that mean as a Black man using a theory that was really created out of the experiences of Black women? What does that mean for you as a Black man? And also, how are you checking your own male privilege and what that looks like? And so I can't really, it's hard for me to answer a yes or a no. I tend to lean on the side of yes, you should be a Black person, and I use Black person just in general, using the theory, because some of the times what I have found is when people do use Black feminism as their organizing theoretical standpoint, who are not a part of the community, sometimes they can in fact misappropriate things or not necessarily understand certain aspects of Black feminism. So again, I go back to, well, what is your intentions of using this as someone who is not a part of the community?
Is Black feminism in some ways similar to post-colonial feminism, where I just did an interview with a girl in Tajikistan, a young woman, and so she wants to separate out the Russian influence from her Tajik nomadic roots. So her job is to see what did colonialism do to our culture, what's really unique to us, what do we want to keep. Would you say that Black feminism does the same kind of thing?
I would say in some ways it does, but I would say what is very unique, what I have found, is that there is this intentional centering of Black women's experiences in Black feminism. And not only our, our day-to-day experiences, but our knowledge, our epistemologies, our ontologies, like that is very unique to me in what Black feminism allows. It's not in, it has to be in comparison to this group or this group. It is literally the centering of our experiences. And I think that is what is unique in the understanding of Black feminism.
So it's like standpoint theory where
Yes.
you go from the experiences of the actual people. That's my source, not my theory, not my observation, but the actual experiences of this group.
Yes. And this particular standpoint is what your theory grows out of. And I think that theory doesn't usually, or a lot of times, I shouldn't say usually, but theory doesn't necessarily always start that way. It starts from this very out here thing, and then maybe I'm going to actually talk to the people who I'm creating this theory about or connect with the people. But Black feminism really does, theory and the experiences are grown out of each other. It is not this separate entity, but they are together. They are very aligned, and it's not the experience is above the theory or the theory is above the experience. It is that they are aligned together, and together they make each other.
So we don't start with Marxian dialectical materialism, class struggle, the importance of economics in shaping our culture, and then impose it. We start from the bottom in terms of, you tell me what was your experience with your body image playing with Barbie dolls when you were 6.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Do you think that the concept of first, second, third, fourth waves is useful? Some people do, some people don't. And if so, what wave do you think we're in now?
Yeah, so I think that the wave sort of metaphor is interesting. I think one issue that I've always had with the waves metaphor is I feel like it kind of encompasses that in each wave there is one single issue, or there is one single feminism that we are putting out to the world, or there's one wave of activism, when it's like, well, that's not the truth. Because even in the first wave, right, even though a lot of times we like to say that was about voting rights, it was about voting rights. A part of it was about voting rights and women's suffrage.
It was also about abolition and
Exactly.
birth
Exactly.
control, poor women.
Exactly. And so I think sometimes when we talk about it as waves, it is ineffective in that way that it fails to recognize that there are multiple things going on that a wave metaphor doesn't necessarily encompass. I think that where it is effective in is recognizing that there is this continuum. So each wave, if we're using that metaphor, does affect the other wave. So there's always this ripple effect in how I understand it. And so I think in that way, the metaphor is effective. But I think that there are ways in which we need to critique that and think about, in one of my actually feminist theories classes, our instructor asked us to think about what might be a better way in describing the different sort of eras of feminism, or the different I like to think of it as iterations. That there are multiple things happening, and this iteration of it has affected and influenced this next generation of it. It didn't just like spring out and now here's feminism, but they affect each other. And so I think that the wave metaphor can sometimes miss the mark in terms of acknowledging that just because, first wave is focused on, or the narrative is that it was focused on voters' rights. Well, there was other things, as you mentioned, abolitionist movements, right? And so there were other things that need to be in focus. That is just the narrative that got told. So I don't know if it's always necessarily an effective way to understand feminism, but I do think that there are different iterations, different generations, different ways that as time goes on, we understand feminism and what is important to the movement, if you will. If we stay with waves, I know a lot of times people say that right now we're in the fourth wave, citing more social media presence, more hashtag movements, and using activism. So I would say if I had to say, what wave we are in, I would say fourth. And it is heavily focused on social media and how a variety of activists are using social media platforms for feminist rights.
And if we say third wave, emphasize intersectionality, and you can't just say sisterhood is global because we're not just sisters, we have different ethnic, religious, ability, sexual orientation. So if first wave is emphasis is voting, second legal rights, changing the laws, third wave intersectionality, fourth social media use. What do you have any predictions what the fifth wave might be?
I do not, because I feel like, and especially with COVID, I think COVID just threw another aspect to things that we didn't necessarily consider. It just threw a wrench in things. So I wouldn't say I have a prediction, but I can imagine that at some point we are going to start talking more about a large area in feminism that I feel has been neglected, which is health. And so thinking about mental health, thinking about physical health, thinking about who does and does not have access and how that affects them. I would think that this part, anyway, especially due to COVID, is going to be I imagine, a big influence in whatever the next iteration of feminism is going to look like. But I couldn't say exactly, this is, what the wave will be.
Another aspect of health is access to abortion. So with Texas and the Arkansas, those laws restricting it really almost completely, that's going to generate a new focus for that health emphasis that you mentioned.
Absolutely, absolutely. I would definitely agree with that. And as women continue to struggle to literally be able to say what they want to do with their bodies, I think that's going to be such an important issue that is, you can't ignore it, especially as these laws become more widespread. Right? I think that you can't just say like, oh, it doesn't exist. But I think health as a larger umbrella is going to be huge in the next iteration of whatever feminism is going to look like.
Got it. I don't remember. How effective the birth control pill is? So they're not going to let me go to a clinic, but I can go to the pharmacy and get this pill. But I don't know how far along you can be in a pregnancy and still have the abortion pill be effective. Do you?
So I think it depends on the state. And so I believe the last one I read, the latest you can get it is pretty much 5 weeks into your pregnancy.
Oh, so you don't even know you're pregnant.
Yes. Yeah. So
you miss your period by a week. I mean, who's going to know they're pregnant?
Exactly. Yeah. So, so I know some places it's the earliest that a doctor can detect a heartbeat. And then other places it is the latest you can do it is 5 weeks. So yeah, you might not have any clue that you are even pregnant in that stage.
Wow. I know that a long time ago, the feminist women's health centers had a device with a jar and a tube that people could do self-help abortions. I haven't heard them talking about that, but that doesn't mean they're not working on it.
Yeah, I have not heard them talk about that. The only thing that I have really heard is the concerns of us going backwards. And also, just because abortion is not legal, that doesn't mean that people are not going to get them in ways that are not detrimental to their body. And so I have heard a lot of talk about that concern. Just because you have a law, that doesn't mean that because as history has showed us, people can and do find other means which can hurt their body even more. And so I know there is a lot of concern around that as well.
I know when I was an undergraduate at Berkeley, women who were pregnant and didn't want to be went to Tijuana. They took the trip all the way to Mexico. So yeah, we know that women will do alternative methods if it's not the right time to be pregnant or they don't want to be pregnant. We talked about the lens of your understanding of feminism from Black feminist perspective. What about the Black girlhood studies lens? How is that any different?
Yeah, so one of the reasons why, and I actually get this question a lot in my work, is well, why don't you just use Black feminism? Why do you use Black girlhood as well, or Black girlhood studies? And one of the my largest reasons is because yes, Black feminism is a very useful concept theory to understand the lives of Black girlhood. But at the end of the day, the perspective that Black feminism was created and generated out, the experiences that it was generated out, was from Black women's experience, right? And so there are some Black feminists who reflect on their girlhood, but they reflect on them as Black women. And so for me, I'm really interested in centering how do we center childhood, and particularly Black girl childhood, when they are children, and how are they theorizing? Because they are, even if they're not calling it theory, they are theorizing about their childhoods, about their girlhoods. And so Black girlhood studies is directly out of the lives of Black girls when they are still in their childhood, and understanding their social political experiences as they are in their childhood and what these experiences mean to them. And so I couple these two because they really do provide strength to each other, but the Black girlhood studies really does allow me to center and think about how does age affect the way in which, for example, Black girls experience education versus how Black women experience education. So they might both experience racism in education, but it looks differently. And some of those things, they might be similar, but it does look differently because of that age, because you are at childhood, because you're at a different developmental stage. I also lean on girlhood studies heavily because if we're not careful, we can re-adultify Black girls when we are analyzing their experiences through the lens of an adult. And so we have to be mindful that they are still children. Even if our world and our society chooses to adultify them as young as 5 years old, they are still children. And so I wanted to be very intentional in my work about making that claim and making that obvious. Now, there's some argument, in Black girlhood studies, and there's some Black women that still do reflect on their girlhood, which is fine. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. And I think that brings beauty to the theory itself. That brings nuance to the theory itself. But I do think that it is important that we are centering the lives of Black girls when they are in their childhood phase.
Yeah, and that avoids what some people are calling adultism.
Exactly. Exactly.
So, what have you been able to do specifically in terms of talking to girls? What kind of questions have you asked them, and what have you found?
Yeah, so some of the questions that I have asked them are, very simple questions. How do you experience Black girlhood? What does it mean to be a Black girl? I love that question. One of the questions in one of my previous studies that I did was, what do you want the community to do about your experiences? Because I was working at a community center with most predominantly Black girls, and one of their concerns was our community doesn't know us and they don't like us.
Did they mean Black community adults, or who did they mean didn't know
the
them?
community that they lived in. So that the physical location, geographical location where they lived. And so, I often heard the community doesn't know us, they don't like us, and they don't understand us. And so, through that, with the girls, we actually came up with this question to answer through photos. What do you want the community to do about your experiences and about them not knowing you or liking you? And one of those answers resulted in our installation at the community center where their pictures were up that they took in the research that they did. And we actually ended up having an organization, the YWC, came into the community center and they saw the pictures and they wanted to know, can we have this installation at our community organization? So with the permission of the girls, we had the installation be actually moved to the YWC, and the YWC had it there for one of their events. And then they also had the installation up for anyone to kind of see the girls' experiences. So a big part of that was awareness, bringing about awareness. Another thing that the girl said was wanting to be included, but the interesting thing was wanting to be included as they were, meaning I don't want to have to conform to your norms or what you think, how you think a Black girl should quote unquote act, or I don't want to have to be in this space of obedience all the time, or that my body has to be a certain way. I want to be included, but I want to be able to just be. And so I thought that was something that was so beautiful. And so asking them those types of questions has been very meaningful for my work. And, I learned so much from that project and from the projects that I continue to do with Black girls as well. So hopefully I will be able to establish more, as I learn Chico, a space for Black girls in Chico as well.
Is there a website where people can see those photographs online?
So there's currently not a website. There is a book in the works that I have been working on for what feels like forever. But there's not currently a website. I would love to have another installation of their work, but I always ask the girls before I do anything with their photos, no matter how many times or how most of them now are almost in their senior year or are in their senior year. So no matter how old they they get, I try to still ask them when I do use their work if it's okay to be showing their work and stuff and their narratives as well. And so there's not currently a website, but something great idea, something that could possibly be in the works in the future.
What will the title of the book, or how are you focusing the book?
Yeah, so the focus of the book is this concept that I partly borrow from Patricia Hill Collins, but also kind of developed with the girls themselves. So Patricia Hill Collins talks about how dominated groups tend to, in light of or in trying to pursue agency, kind of pursue what she calls oppositional knowledge. And so opposition into what dominant society says you should be, or this is how you should think, or this is how your body should be. And so what I found with the girls is that there are a variety of ways that they quite literally create visual oppositional knowledge, whether it is through their hair and deciding that I'm going to wear my natural hair, even if the school says that's not quote unquote appropriate or goes with the policy. Or I'm going to have these long, bright nails, even though people might deem this as ghetto or this is looked down upon, because I think that this is pretty, this is me, this is, I'm being expressive. Or I'm going to wear these shorts, even though the school might say, on a Black girl, that's not appropriate for your body, but it's hot as heck. So I'm going to wear this because I'm hot. And also I think these are cute. And so there are ways in which the girls are very intentional of using visual oppositional knowledge. And so that's what the book will focus on. I don't quite have a title yet, but that is what the book will focus on, and will show how they use this knowledge, how they actually do this knowledge.
Does graffiti play a part in this oppositional expression?
For the girls that I worked with, it surprisingly did not play, a role. A lot of it was, in the Black Girlhood studies community, a lot of people talk about hair was a huge thing that they talked about. And I think a lot of it is because especially lately, the policing of hair, and that's for both Black women and Black girls. Really, it exists on a wide scale. And so hair is a huge thing that played a large role in the girls that I worked with, at least.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about other aspects of your research. You were involved in helping kids learn youth activism.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you teach that or encourage it or facilitate it?
Yeah, so it depends on the space that I am. That will depend on the lens that I take. So sometimes it might be about leadership. I also led an after school program in thinking about bullying and how do we create a space for anti-bullying behaviors. And not a space where it's like, well, they're being a tattletale. And it's like, no, you're not being a tattletale, but how do we create these spaces? And a lot of times too, in my work, as the adult, I try not to impose so much what I think, but I come in with what one of my mentors called a menu of options. And sometimes the kids will be like, yeah, let's do that. I'm really liking that. And other times the kids are like, no, we don't want to do that. Let's scrap that and think of something else. And so a big part of, the activism is through research. So through writing and doing like YPAR, youth participatory action research. So allowing them to think through what is the action that you want to engage with. Sometimes it is like with the girls, it is awareness. With the anti-bullying project, it was, we need to have more spaces and conversational spaces that are led by youth in our school. We need to have more awareness. We need to have the kids in that case, in that research, they wanted to have signs about bullying and how you recognize this. And so it really does depend on what the kids want to do. I always like to say, because I think that sometimes people think that activism is only protest. If you go to protest, that means you're an activist. That is a part of it, absolutely. But there are so many other ways, and especially for kiddos, that activism looks like. For some of them, activism is through their writing. For some of them, activism might be writing a letter to their principal expressing why something is an issue. For some of them, it might be having an art gallery opening of their experiences. And so being intentional and really listening to that is something that I try to do in my work.
Well, I organized youth speak outs to find out what people in the community, young people, wanted. And what they wanted was more activities and places for them to hang out. And what I found, and this is for adults too, what gets people to come to meetings, whatever, is food and music. Ashanti Branch is a activist in the Bay Area who organizes mostly young men of color, and he got them involved first by giving them lunch in his classroom.
Yes. Food is a great motivator. I know when I was growing up, it was a great motivator for me, food or candy or something of that nature, but something fun. I think that sometimes as adults, and especially when you're in academia, it's easy for things to be not seen as fun and dry and, oh, I'm teaching at you type of thing. But with youth, you really can't. I mean, you should not do that with any population, quite frankly. But with youth, that really doesn't work. You're not going to keep their attention. So it is finding ways in which you can engage them and you can connect with them. And it's not another space where I'm telling you who to be, how to act, how you're going to do this, but it has to be, in my experience, it has to become more of a collaboration.
Right. Yeah. After I turned the organizing over to some other group on campus, and they had an adult come in and lecture to them. And I'm sitting in the back of the room going, oh my God, no. Cut her off. I mean, they didn't get it, that it's about youth organizing. Anyway, let's just briefly talk about some of your research, like your article on lies my teacher educator still tells, using critical race counter narratives to disrupt whiteness in teacher education. That sounds interesting. Tell us about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So a part of my work, I always like to say there are 3 areas to my work, and I would love to see them all come together one day, but I'm still trying to figure out that part. So a lot of it is I do community-based organizations, researching how they work with youth, and especially youth of color, particularly Black youth. And then Black Girlhood has been sort of my main focus, and also understanding how they kind of navigate a variety of educational spaces, including community-based organizations. And then the third prong of my work is working with pre-service teachers and understanding how they understand the racialized lives of their students. How are they preparing to go into the classroom? So one day I would like to see these things come together. I haven't figured that out yet, but eventually I know I can do it. So with that piece in particular, we were using critical race theory. So I was supporting one of my professors at the time, supporting her in using critical race theory in her classroom. And so the thing that she does is quite literally in her classroom, she teaches through a critical race theory lens while also teaching it to her students at the same time. And so one of the books that she, and I'm blanking on his first name, James Lowen, he wrote a book about the lies we are told, basically the lies my teacher tells me about history. And so in his book, he's kind of talking about all the ways that we lie about our history and how we teach these things. And it's an ongoing cycle. And so we use this to think about what are some of the lies that we tell pre-service teachers, people who want to be teachers, as we are preparing them to get ready to go into the classroom. What does that look like? And so one of the things that we did is to use critical race theory as the teaching lens, but then also teaching it to the student as we went on, to kind of investigate these lies that we tell. What does it mean to be a good teacher, right? And so one of the lies is that, well, you need to control, because our society is all about control. You need to control your students' bodies, right? That's important. You need to control your students' bodies. And so we're trying to gaze, where do these lies that we learn about our students, about how we prepare to become teachers, where do they actually come from? And so one of the things that we found, or one of the biggest things that we found when we did like a workshop, and basically what we did in the workshop is we brought in a whole bunch of history books that would really actually be used to be taught in the classroom. And so we use these books for the students to analyze and engage with and talk about the language. And in one of the books, one of the things that they said is they referred to Black enslaved Africans as workers rather than slaves.
Oh, yeah.
And so how does that change the narrative? And then if you're a teacher teaching out of this book, what does that mean? And so we engage the students in this, but in trying to figure out, where do these lies that we have been told, where do they come from? One of the things that we found with that study is that a lot of times, in our case, the pre-service teachers blame it on external. So it is not my fault that I don't know these things, or it's not my fault that I have these beliefs, or I wasn't taught this, or my teachers didn't teach me this, and so it was really difficult for them to actually take onus and responsibility and say, even if I wasn't taught this, at some point in my life, as someone who wants to go into the classroom and is more than likely going to be interacting with students who come from a variety of backgrounds, it is my responsibility to unlearn this, and then in place of that, relearn some of the things that will be in some of the curriculums and histories that will actually be helpful for my students. And so that's what that study was really looking at, is what are the lies that students have been told by universities who train them, and then how are they navigating through this? What do they feel like is their responsibility to unlearn the lies about our society, about how to interact with students, especially students of color, especially students who are differently abled? What does that actually look like for these students?
Critical race theory had a lot to do with the defeat of Democratic governor candidate in Virginia, Terry McCulloch. Then his Republican opponent, said the day one he's going to outlaw critical race theory, which isn't even an official policy. So I'd appreciate it if you define what it is.
Yeah. So critical race theory, in a nutshell, is a way really to understand how our society is racialized, basically, and how racism operates systematically. So in our systems, in our policies, in our law, it acknowledges, in a nutshell, that racism is real, right? And a lot of people don't like that. So they then in turn say that critical race theory is racist. And that misses the point. And so in critical race theory, there's these tenets. Racism is permanent in our society. It's not going away. I'm spacing on his name. Derek Bell. He talks about how critical race theory acknowledges that racism is permanent in our current society and how we live and structure our life. It is real. Another tenet is that it's called interest convergence, that things don't happen, policies don't tend to change in our society that have to do with race unless there is an interest on the side of the white side, right? So white people have to be interested. There has to be some sort of benefit on their side and their perspective in order for things to actually change. And so they use the example in the critical race theory book, they use the example of the Brown versus the Board of Education. So that is a very celebrated case that happened in our history that desegregated or helped desegregate schools. But one of the things that the case does not recognize, although it was historical and very important, it does not recognize that when schools were desegregated, people of color, children of color, did not get to stay in their schools. They had to go to the white schools, right? And so instead of saying, oh, let's put some resources in these schools and integrate white children as well in the in the black schools and the Mexican schools, no, we're going to make sure all the children of color go to the white schools, right? What does that tell children of color in return? There is a deficiency and there is something wrong with your schools, but if you just go to the white schools, then everything will be okay and you'll be okay. And so critical race theory is just this way to really systemically critique the way in which our systems in our society have been racialized. And people don't like that.
But it's so obvious. It's not like it's a subtle issue. It's an obvious issue. So how can anyone argue against it? I don't understand.
You would think so, but I had a student in their reflection. We were talking about white supremacy, and I had a student say, "Well, it kind of exists, not really." And I don't know how it can kind of exist, but not really. I don't really know what that means, but he said it kind of exists, but not really. And then the student goes to list all the ways in which, well, if white supremacy was a thing, how come there are black basketball players is what they listed, that are famous and making all this money? And so totally missed the mark or the point or the understanding of white supremacy. But people do definitely deny that these things exist. And it's as if I don't acknowledge, or if I say this thing makes me uncomfortable, or this is not real, or my favorite, this is racist against white people, then it's not true. Then it doesn't.
You can't deny that slavery existed or that Native American indigenous people were exterminated and given smallpox blankets and all that. There's just too many people.
You would think so, but I still, and I would say it's not a large amount, just a small amount. But I do have students that are very in denial, and it's very difficult for them to talk about these issues or that racism still exists. Even though in my class I'm very forthcoming, and as you know, I use storytelling a lot. I tell my stories about experiencing racism as a Black woman in America, experiencing it in the United States. Not that I had to go to a different country to experience it. I experience it from the country that I'm from, and there are students who still will deny that racism is a problem.
I interviewed a Black woman student who left Chico State. It's on my YouTube channel a couple years ago, and she said she would get in the elevator and white students would walk out. So they wouldn't have to be in the elevator with her. So she left Chico.
Oh, I mean, I 100% believe it. It's sad that, those things still happen, but they do. And I think that sometimes people think like, oh, well, that's an individual incident. But it's like, it's not an individual incident.
Because they add up.
Yes, exactly. It's happening in our systems, in our educational system, our criminal justice system. There's so many ways in which racism is perpetuated, and it also does happen in the interpersonal level, but it's happening on multiple levels.
Absolutely. I think we've covered a lot. Is there anything that we've left out in terms of young feminist activism or anything that you want to add?
I don't think so. I think we covered a lot of ground in our time together.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.